Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Britt Andreatta, who's an internationally recognized thought leader who uses her background in leadership, neuroscience, psychology, and education to create science-based solutions for today's workplace challenges. She is also the CEO of a Brain Aware Training and former CLO of lynda.com, now part of LinkedIn Learning. She has over 10 million views worldwide of her online courses, and she regularly consults with organizations on leadership development and learning strategy. She's also a best-selling author of several books, including the Wired to Resist, Wired to Connect, and the Wired to Grow book, which is going to be the focus of today's program. Welcome to this episode, Britt.
Thank you, Charles. I'm really excited to talk to you and your listeners.
Wonderful. Well, before we get started, I always like to ask that first question around your background and what got you interested or having the desire to be an expert in this space.
Thank you for asking. My PhD is in education, leadership, and organization. So I've always studied that intersection of leadership and learning. But when I was getting my doctorate, neuroscience wasn't really a thing yet. We hadn't really started to delve into the human experience in that way. So when I became the chief learning officer at lynda.com, and this was after many years in higher ed and as a researcher, I really wanted to learn more about my craft. And I was very curious what neuroscience was discovering about how the brain learns. So I did a deep dive just for my own ability to be a practitioner, and I was astounded by what I found. So that became the first edition of Wired to Grow. And then just a couple years ago, I did a second edition. And I don't know if you know this, but a second edition, you only have to change 20% of a book. But so much had changed in research on the brain and how we learn that I literally had to rewrite the entire book. Like, it's still a very fast moving field. So that's kind of how I ended up here. I'm also a practitioner. I do leadership development with Fortune 100 companies all around the world. And I love working with executive teams and leaders at every level in the organization.
Thank you for providing that. And Wired to Grow 2.0 is one of my favorite books on the topic. And I get this asked a lot by our listeners is, give us some optimal ways to learn better, especially as adult learners, which is different than where they were taught and how they were taught in school. So getting into your three-phase model of learning, it's that learn, remember, and do. Perhaps you can just give us kind of an overview of those three steps, and then we'll start with the remember phase after that.
Yeah, and in the book, I go into the research, but I really talk to the reader as, how can you maximize your own learning? But I have an entire section of the book that's dedicated to learning professionals and how we can design better learning, because it turns out that how we all did school was wrong. It doesn't really align with how the brain learns. So the three phases are learn, which is the learning event, whatever that looks like when you're taking in information. And then there's a lot of things we can do to push that into memory so it's there for us later. I feel like if you learn something but you don't have access to it later or you don't use it later, was it really valuable? And then there's do. A lot of learning, particularly learning we do for professional adults, is to change a behavior of some kind, to actually shift a word or an action out in the workplace. So that's really about the habit design and changing our behaviors and what we can do to set someone up to do that smoothly and to create that sustained behavior change. So it kind of falls in those three things. And then it lives in a bed of psychological safety. You have to have that for people to maximize learning. And then you absolutely can utilize technology to facilitate speed or growth or access. So technology plays a role, but we were designed to learn as a species. So we learn with or without technology, but technology can enhance it or get in the way of it, actually.
Well, I've seen too that a lot of people that aren't good learners or don't like to learn things, maybe in the past they've had bad results on an IQ test or an IQ measure, or they've been told by teachers, parents that they just aren't good learners. And that's kind of set that wrong precedent for them to really actively engage in the learning process. And I know that IQ tests really don't measure everything that makes everyone unique and a good learner, and that there's other intelligence models like Howard Gardner's model deals with 9 different types of intelligence, so that people feel like even if they didn't score well in a certain type of IQ measurement, it doesn't mean they can't be good learners, right? And they don't have intelligence in other ways.
Absolutely. I mean, I think why so many educators resonated with Gardner's model when it came out was that if you'd been in a classroom, you realized people had different kinds of intelligence. The problem is that traditional school, from kindergarten all the way to graduate courses, really focus on only 2 of the 9 intelligences. So your linguistic and your mathematical. illogical, mathematical. And people can be smart in all kinds of areas. What I think is really fascinating is in 2017, two researchers looked at the neuroscience of those nine intelligences, and they found that there was neurological evidence that, in fact, they exist. They're all neurologically different. They tap into different parts of the brain. And so I think any of us who are in education really need to continue to get the word out that you can be smart in all kinds of ways. And we need to expand our education settings to really honor all the different ways people have intelligence.
I completely agree with you, and I hope that gets more traction in the years to come. I think it's already gained a lot of traction, which is great to hear, especially in our educational system. You also mentioned in the book, which I think is worth mentioning here, is that it's the energy flow throughout the day, and there's a good time to learn certain things throughout the day, so that you don't think that, when you're in late afternoon, that may not be the best time to learn and absorb or kind of do deep work like Cal Newport states. It's maybe a better time to be more creative in that case. If you could walk us through those three phases of the day and maybe when's the best time to learn certain things.
This is really Dan Pink's research from his book When. And he really talks about that we're all on a continuum from he calls the early morning folks larks and the late night folks owls. And then everyone in the middle is kind of a third bird. But there's really a lot of research around when we're primed for the best kind of work. So focused, detailed work is done best in the morning. More abstract work, creative work is done best in the afternoon. But I always like to put a caveat here that, you also need to listen to yourself. Like, I'm a morning person. My husband is a late night person. So my definition of morning is, 6 to 11. His definition of morning is 11 to 12. So, and it really depends on if he's had coffee. So I also think that it's really important to pay attention to yourself. Not everyone's going to fall into those phases, but if you want to dig into the research, Dan Pink put together some really great data that also identifies when you should also seek out other people's expertise. So, for example, certain medical procedures, they're much more likely to find things in the morning when they're fresh and not exhausted. When we do a lot of repetitive tasks, we can start to get a little blind to what we're looking for. So, absolutely, but listen to yourself more than anything. That's going to be the true measure of when you learn best.
Yeah, that's great insight, and I'll put another plug in by Dan Pink When. Pink When. It's a great book. Let's get into memory. So memory, and I love how you stated that all learning becomes a memory. So in order to best understand learning, you need to really start with an in-depth exploration of the nature of memories and how you form them. And there's two types of memory: short-term memory, long-term memory. The goal is to get everything from the short-term into the long-term. And there's ways to optimize this process. But first, looking at short-term memory and that working piece of it, and that 7 plus 2, plus or minus two things that everyone has said, that's as much as we can hold in short-term memory at any one point in time, is somewhat accurate, but not completely accurate.
Yeah, so I discovered that what we know right now, it's going to change, is that there's nine types of human memory, and they fall into two main categories: short term memory, of which there's two types, sensory memory, which is everything that your senses are taking in. And we hold on to those for seconds, but really, our brain kind of ditches that unless something significant happens. And then there's working memory, which lasts for minutes. All of this happens in the neocortex. That when we talk about 5 plus or minus 2, we're really talking about kind of chunking information. And that's still a useful tool to think about. For example, that's why phone numbers are the length that they are, right? We kind of know that it's easy for people to remember a certain length. However, there are people, memory champions, who have used all kinds of techniques to really extend their memory. So we have the ability to hold a lot more in memory. But yeah, working memory is that kind of what we hold on to for minutes. And then the second big category is long-term memory. And for those of us in education, we want to get stuff into long-term memory. We want it to be there for people to be able to use in the future.
Absolutely. And with working memory, like you were saying, that 7 plus or minus 2, that really fits for new information. But like you mentioned, if you have a pre-existing schema, if you're connecting it with something you already know or you're somewhat familiar, then that could be expanded because you already have some of the mental constructs or the lattice work in place, so you can hopefully absorb more within that period of time.
Yeah, when we think about memory, there is an experience that we have and we're taking that in through our senses, and then we encode that through our senses into memory. And then later we recall it. And one of the things that scientists have discovered is that our brain has what they call schemas. You can think of them as file folders where all your experiences get filed, but there's an infinite number of them. And one experience could get filed into 10 different file folders. So for example, I've traveled to France, it's in my foreign travel folder, it's in things I've done with my husband folder, it's in my iconic architecture folder. And so different things can pull or recall that memory. And so I like to remind people that things are encoded through our senses, which is why you could walk by a bakery and smell croissants, and instantly that memory of France is pulled back up. You can also run into a friend who you know has traveled to France, and now that relationship is what calls that back up. So there's lots of threads we can tug to bring memory back into people's conscious awareness. And certainly our phones do this now when it feeds up kind of photos from your past when you first log in the morning.
Well, and mentioning and adding to that, you're right. You can get involved the better when you want to remember something. Also, the more emotions that you can use, it provides a stronger memory trace as well.
Absolutely. So, as a learning designer, you want to think about first of all, can I hook new knowledge to a file folder or a schema that people already have? If you ever had a great math or science teacher who was taking something pretty abstract and conceptual and making it easy to understand, they were doing that. They were attaching it to something you already knew. But we can all use this trick for ourselves or when we're designing learning. So, for example, I've built a change management training, and the whole thing is around the metaphor or the imagery of going hiking or mountain climbing. And even if you, Charles, have never done that in your life, I know that you know what it is. So we want to pick metaphors, imagery that people share regardless of background, ethnicity, gender, age, etc., because that's where you're going to create your best chances of connecting to an experience someone has had.
And metaphors and analogies are a great tool to use. I also recall from your book that during that change course, you used music, and I think you used the Beatles song Yesterday just to signify that the change was happening. That was then, this is now, and how to embrace it in a more positive manner.
Yeah, the research on music is really phenomenal. Music is the only thing that actually gets woven into every brain region, which is why throughout your life you can remember the lyrics to thousands of songs, thousands. You just hear a couple notes and boom, it's right back. But healthcare workers are actually using that to help people heal. So when Congresswoman Gabby Giffords was shot, and she was shot in the head and had some brain damage, she could no longer speak. Her language center was damaged, but she could sing. And so the speech therapist had her sing all these songs as they rewired her language center. We see similar research with people who have Alzheimer's. You can take someone who is looking at their spouse and has no memory of them, but if you put on earphones and play a playlist of songs that were significant in their lifetime to them, the memories come flooding back, and all of a sudden they're present with their loved one. It doesn't last, but you can keep doing it again and again to keep bringing that person back to themselves. So music is phenomenal as a way to create learning, to hook it to memory. I think there's a whole generation of us from Schoolhouse Rock, and I often do this when I'm speaking to a large audience. I just start singing conjunction junction, and the whole audience will erupt in, what's your function?
Absolutely. And it's something too that I like how you use it as well, because you can prime your brain to a certain state to make learning more receptive, which you say you have playlists when you give training classes, when you give development opportunities to individuals, so they can make sure that they're primed in such a way to make it more receptive, to connect it in a deeper way, and then to remember it when that playlist is played again.
Yeah, I think all learning designers should be playing with this idea of music and figuring out how and where you can use it.
So let's move into the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And we've used it quite a bit in the industry for learning. It's a partially right model, but it only tests one type of memory, and that's pure memory, and maybe not the best model to use when we think of forgetting, correct?
Correct. It's one of those models, and it's funny how a model will get traction, but when you dig into the actual research, it was in a very limited, very narrowly focused setting. And then we kind of took it to like, oh, this is how all memory works, which is not the case. So, what we know about memory now is, first of all, there's 9 types. And I want to at some point talk about long term memory. But we also know that the best way to boost recall or retrieval is actually through retrievals. So a retrieval is when I'm having to go back into my mind and pull out knowledge. So think about flashcards or a quiz. I'm having to go in there and pull the information back out. And that what the research shows is that when you're wanting to help people boost their retention of knowledge, having them go through 3 retrievals, that's kind of the sweet spot. Less is not effective and more is not, doesn't really get you much more. So it's 3 retrievals, most effective when spaced with sleep, so that your brain has had time to sleep in between. That seems to be the magic formula. So you can think about, if you and I had a learning event today, in a couple days, I might want to send you a question or two that asks you to kind of go back in and recall, or give you a pop quiz, or have you use that information in some way. So retrievals is the key with memory and helping people increase their retention.
And those retrievals, it's better than repetition. So it's retrieving. So you can do quizzes, you can do tests, you can try to teach it to someone else, but rereading doesn't really work. It's not that effective. You want that retrieval process to happen at some point, like you said, spaced out at various intervals after the learning event.
Correct. Because, just rereading, you're just taking it back in again. And what you want to practice is going in there and pulling it back out. You want to practice recalling what you know.
So, if the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve is really not the proper model, you mentioned another model from 2 UCLA professors, a new theory of disuse that memories really depend on storage strength and retrieval strength. So, perhaps we can kind of delve into a little bit of the long term memory here as part of this model.
Yeah, no, it's great. So when we think about kind of these 9 types of memory, when we get over to long term memory, they fall into 2 main buckets. One is explicit memory or conscious memory. It's a memory that you have, you're conscious of having it. Scientists also call that declarative. And then we also have a whole bunch of memories that are known as implicit or unconscious, also called non declarative. So when we think about memories and particularly how we work with it in the learning space, we do a lot with explicit memory. We've got semantic memory, which is where people are learning facts, concepts. It's kind of like your traditional school stuff. This all happens at the hippocampus. And then the strongest type of memory, the most powerful, is episodic memory, which is kind of when you're living your life and you're the star of the show and you're taking everything in through your senses and your first person point of view. Super powerful, kind of the strongest type of memory. And this is why VR is so powerful, is that when you put on that headset, even though cognitively you're not hiking that mountain or swimming with the orcas, your brain believes that it is. And so what's interesting about VR is it's actually coding in the brain as a lived memory, even though you haven't had that experience. Got to be careful with children though, because their cognitive discernment is not very strong. So when you have kids who have a VR experience, they're not sure if it was real or not. So we have to be super careful using these powerful techniques with children. And then in the implicit category, we've got things like associative learning. That's like your somatic learning. Think of Pavlov's dogs and salivating, ringing the bell. That happens in the cerebellum. We have emotional learning, like when you are almost in a car accident and your adrenaline fires off and the amygdala is involved. That creates a certain type of really crystal clear, almost slow-mo memory of that experience. We also have non associative memory, which is kind of habituation and sensitization. Think of moving next to train tracks, and after a while, you don't hear that train come by anymore. And then we have the whole area of habits. And this is procedural learning, or we're learning a skill or developing a new habit. And that all happens in the basal ganglia. And repetition matters there, but we'll talk about that when we get to the do part of the model. But when we think about memory, we have all these potential types of memory. Each one of them activates a different brain region. And so as a learning designer, you kind of want to think about, what do I want to activate in people? And then intentionally choose the tools and methods that accelerate that type of learning. It's not all the same. So you want to have some discernment here.
Let's talk about an individual going to a learning event and kind of identifying what they should be doing before, during, and after it to maximize the learning at that event. And then maybe we can put in some best practices within each one of those 3 phases. So So before a learning event, and this could be a training, it could be a development opportunity, it could just be them wanting to read a self-help book or watch a documentary that they want to glean some insights out of. What should they do before they go into that learning event or class?
Great question. First of all, we want to be focused. So we know from the research that when we are multitasking while learning or when we have many distractions, our brain does not code a real clear chunk of information. It has holes in it because we don't multitask, we switch task. So we can focus on learning, but then if I'm checking my email, I kind of am not really getting that detail from the learning. So you really want to focus, close off distractions. We do know that things like note taking make a difference, and handwritten is better than typing. There's just something about how our brain is wired that when we handwrite notes, it actually helps boost learning. You want to think about the best time and place for you as a learner. Obviously, we learn better if we're in a place where we're interested, when we're engaged, when we're not afraid, when we're not starving. There's things that can get in the way of our ability to focus. I also believe in, check out the right environment for you in terms of some people really do well virtually. Some people really love being in a crowd. There are some individual differences that I encourage you to find the form and format that aligns with how you learn best. I think we all learn best from a engaged teacher who is passionate and good at educating others. So definitely pick and choose amongst the options you have available. In the middle of it, it turns out human attention span really is only 15 to 20 minutes before we naturally kind of fade away and then come back. The best educators chunk their content delivery into 15-minute chunks and then give you a moment to process it, whether it's just taking some notes for yourself, talking to a partner, taking a little assessment. But if your educator is not doing that for you, just know you're going to fade out every 15 or 20 minutes and then come back. So you want to have a way to capture what you missed, like recording it or, working with a partner so you fill in each other's gaps. And then, of course, after the event, reviewing your notes, applying it, making it real to your life in some way, retrieving it. Those are all ways you can boost your learning experience from the beginning to the end.
Well, and this works equally well if you're being trained by someone else or self-learning. After 20 minutes, take a break, process, reflect, elaborate, right, on those notes by putting it into your own words. Something that you said in your book before the event that I really want to touch upon too is that try to answer comprehension questions about the material before you learn about them. And it may seem counterintuitive, right? Why would you want to answer questions about topics you have not yet studied yet? But there is a neuroscience explanation to that, right?
Absolutely. It's called priming. I didn't mention it because I think that learners don't necessarily have the ability to do this for themselves. But certainly, if you're an educator, priming means that you give people the test on the first day. And what happens, and you need to make it safe and say, you're not going to know these answers. You're going to get a lot of them wrong. Don't worry about it. Just give it a try. But what scientists have found is essentially when we are asked a question, the brain goes, this must be important because someone's asking it of me. And so it essentially creates a file folder, a little temporary schema because it knows that information is important. And so later, when you're in the learning event, you're now in the lecture, you're now at the training, and you get that answer, it slots in and it makes it stickier. So priming is something that you can do before the event. Certainly as an educator, you can do this for yourself, but you have to get a little creative for how you do it for yourself. But it does help the brain really retain that information when it comes along.
And something else you said too is that write your notes, don't use a computer, because several studies have shown handwriting generates more comprehension and recall than typing. And make sure that you are fully focused, right, on that learning event and make sure that you're in attendance, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And then some people our brain thinks in pictures. We learned pictures. We learned what a cat was long before we could ever say the word cat. And then we went to school and learned what letters make the word cat, right? So we're visual learners for the most part. So some people really do well with, illustrated learning or pictographs or that kind of thing. Again, if you're an educator, you can use imagery to really bolster people's memory and learning experience, but you can do it for yourself as well. Some people are great with word clouds or mind maps. So play with these different techniques and see what seems to align best for you and really helps you learn.
Before we move into the doing part, two other areas that I wanted to kind of focus on was first is you have to have the right mindset. And there's a lot of research done on Carol Dweck's work out of Stanford on the growth versus fixed mindset. And the growth mindset is really a better mindset overall to have because you're looking at learning as a growth opportunity and you're embracing mistakes and building from those mistakes and learning better versus a fixed mindset. Any insight that you can give listeners to really get into that growth mindset easier and the advantages of it when it comes to learning?
Yeah. So, just a quick reminder, Dweck is a psychologist and she was studying what makes people be successful. And she found that people fell into kind of two categories. They either had a fixed mindset, meaning they felt like their traits were their traits. They were either good at math or they weren't. They had people skills or they didn't. And once you're an adult, you really cannot learn new things. So, you just got to pick out your strengths and play to your strengths. The folks who are the most successful in life had a growth mindset and they believed, no, I can always learn something new. I can get better with practice. If I dig in and learn, I can make myself better at anything. And so they had an attitude about learning and growing that shaped their career trajectory. What's interesting is that neuroscientists have proven that the truth of the human brain is growth mindset. We have both neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, which means we can create and change neural pathways literally until the moment that we die. And so I like to teach people about it because if you were raised with a fixed mindset, you can start to learn about these concepts and make yourself a growth mindset person. And so it really can be if you shift your attitude around. I mean, really, we have already discovered how to take people who've been paralyzed for years and now they're growing new nerves and people are walking again. Like what we know about the body's ability to generate new nerves and learn and grow is really truly phenomenal. So if you embrace that, you start to realize, oh, I don't really have very many limitations here. I just need to find the right path forward. And so I think embracing a growth mindset and knowing that your brain absolutely has the capabilities of growing new neural pathways makes it easier to go into something that might seem challenging.
That is so critical, and it's so needed today and needed to be reinforced continually because so many people don't have that yet, and it's a skill that you have to practice over time. But having that mindset can make a big difference in terms of your receptivity and your assimilation of new knowledge and getting you into that next level of growth. Talk to me a little bit about the flow state, because that's the ideal state to learn anything. Many people feel like if you can get into a state of flow, things just come naturally and it's so easy to absorb, to learn. You're kind of right on that cusp of it being too challenging, but yet not challenging enough. And that optimal level where things become easier and learning accelerates exponentially.
Yeah, so this research really talks about if you think about the vertical axis and the horizontal axis, that you want to have a certain level of difficulty. If we're put into a situation where our skill set is far below what's being asked of us, right? We're in distress, we're in stress, we're in worry, we're in anxiety. And if we're put in another situation where our skill set is far advanced from what's being asked of us, then we're in boredom and apathy and lack of stimulation. So the best, it's called the flow state. You're kind of in that middle channel where you're challenged. You want to have a little challenge. Challenge actually arouses the nervous system. It stimulates us. It actually makes us hunger to learn more. You want to be in that right sweet spot because it's really what helps you grow and maximize your ability to grow. So you want it to be a little beyond your current edge, but not impossible. And then it changes over time, right? So part of what we have to pay attention to for ourselves is, gosh, you started a job 2 years ago and it was right at your edge and you really enjoyed it and you were growing, but now you've gotten good at it. So it's likely that same job is now kind of moved into the boredom area for you. It's not stimulating enough. So how can you work with your supervisor or change jobs so that you continue to push yourself into that just on the edge of comfort so that you're always in flow state? And when we're in flow, it's that state where time passes. All of a sudden you look at your clock and it's been 3 hours and you didn't even notice because you were just so absorbed in what you were doing. So, flow state is really important. And it's something that we all have to find for ourselves.
Those are some great insights. Let's move into the do part of the model, and that's really about building skills in habit building. Give us some insights into this step of the model, and I love how you say with memory and learning, you really want to stress retrieval over repetition, but in this stage, it's about getting in the reps.
Absolutely. So, in terms of changing behaviors, this is all the work of the basal ganglia. So, let me just talk a little bit about it. The basal ganglia is the part of the brain that pays attention to when we're doing something over and over again, and it wants to be an energy saver. So, if you think about when you're learning anything new, there's a lot of activation in the prefrontal cortex. You're concentrating, you're thinking about it, you're practicing, you're working hard at it. That takes a lot of energy. They measure brain burn in glucose. And over time, that's not very efficient. So the basal ganglia is kind of constantly looking at, we've been doing this behavior a bit. We should turn this into a low energy package that can kind of run on autopilot. And that's kind of the definition of a habit. So we've all experienced this, right? Think about when you were learning how to drive a car for the first time. We're doing that in my household right now with my teenager. It's a lot, the accelerator, the brake, the mirrors, the steering wheel. For some of us, it was a clutch, right? There was a lot to think about. And yet, once you get the hang of it, you don't think about the act of driving anymore. You can get to your destination and kind of be like, oh, wait, I'm here. That's the basal ganglia at work. Same thing when you learn a new app on your smartphone. At first, you have to kind of think about it, and then now you don't even have to think about it. So, the basal ganglia is amazing. Those of us who work in adult professional learning, we are often trying to change habits. And so, you want to think about repetition. It's grooving that neural pathway. And the more you run that neural pathway, the stronger that neural pathway gets. And so there is kind of some research that there's a magic number. I mean, there's a big range, but kind of on average, it's 40 to 50 repetitions of a behavior is when that habit kind of starts to really get formed. And at 66 repetitions, the neurons actually get thicker. They can measure them getting thicker. So they're a lot like a muscle. You use them, they get stronger. You ignore them, they atrophy. So, when we think about workplace learning, we're oftentimes asking people to step away from a habit that's well grooved and comfortable and they don't have to think about it, and instead start to do a behavior that's awkward, new, requires concentration, is not an automatic behavior yet. So, as a learning designer, you've got to start grooving those repetitions in the learning event. You've got to have them practice. Otherwise, when they go back to their office or the field or whatever, they're naturally going to go to the old behavior unless you're intentionally getting people to that 40 or 50 number.
Well, I like how you said it's about the reps. We had BJ Fogg on the podcast earlier this year, and he mentioned something similar. He's out of Stanford and has a great book on habit design, behavior design, tiny habits. And he said it's not so much a time frame where you say, in 30 days and 50 days and 60 days. It's really about if you can get those reps in and groove those neural pathways, then habit design is a lot easier. But even with that being said, it's hard to get away from bad habits. And one of the big things in the space, and you mentioned in your book, is it is about habit stacking for an individual. If you can attach a new habit to a habit that already exists, you increase the likelihood that it's going to happen.
Absolutely. The research on this is really clear that you don't want kind of a new behavior floating by itself. If you attach it to a habit that's already there. Classic example, if you want to get better at flossing your teeth, attach it to when you brush your teeth, right? You've already got a habit in place. Now you're adding another habit to it. And we can think about all kinds of habits. The other thing that I think is really important with habits is to break it down. Break it down into small steps that are so small someone cannot fail, and then build those little behaviors together. Oftentimes, when we're teaching someone a new skill, we give them 20 steps. It's completely overwhelming. And we really want to break it down. Okay, you got that first part right. Now we're adding the next part. Dance choreographers do this all the time. They give you 8 beats at a time and you get that down and they add 8 more beats. And the next thing you know, you've got a 4-minute choreographed performance. You add it on pieces at a time, and that's how to do it the best way.
The other thing that I love about what you state on habit design, which I think is spot on, is having the right rewards. Because so often when we try to build these new habits, the rewards are not immediate. So it's really hard to get them to be grooved in faster. We aren't celebrating enough. We're not breaking them down enough. It's just this complex habit that you don't see the payoff for years to come, which is disincentivizing. And it's much harder to build that new habit. And it's much easier to keep the current old or bad habit.
Yeah, and this is where we can all use this research for ourselves. Like if you're trying to change a behavior, your brain is going to be much more likely because the habit loop is the cue, the thing that tells you to do the behavior, then the routine, the little set of behaviors, and then reward, right? And so you want to keep looping that. And oftentimes when we're learning something new, we don't give ourselves a reward when it would help us. You don't have to reward yourself forever, but it's really helpful if you reward yourself the first 30 times you do a behavior. I worked with one executive who's really trying to change a behavior. And so he put together on his desk, he put in 40 M&Ms in his desk. And he made an intentional choice that every time he did the behavior, he gave himself an M&M. Rewards can look in all kinds of ways. It can be a click, it can be a high five. When I exercise, after I'm done, I let myself listen to my favorite podcast. There's things that you can do to intentionally work with how the brain forms habits, but definitely build rewards in at the beginning. And then once the habit is established, you don't have to keep rewarding it. The brain has now formed it.
You're right. It's part of the identity that you now are. So it's much easier at that point. But that initial process can be difficult. And it also depends on the types of practice that you do as well. And there's been a lot of talk with Anders Ericsson's work regarding deliberate practice versus mindless practice, because there's this, and I think Malcolm Gladwell first kind of threw this out there to everyone, that it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert. And really, you need to qualify that. It's doing the right types of practice is going to get you to mastery much sooner than doing the wrong types of practice. So perhaps you can kind of go through that scale or that spectrum of naive, mindless practice all the way through up to deliberate practice.
Yeah. And before I do that, I would just kind of remind folks that if you're learning something new, you have to think about, well, what level do you need to learn it, right? We've got from total beginner to true master or expert. And if you're a manager, you probably need to get an intermediate level of budgeting. Like you need to understand the basics and be able to keep track of stuff. If you're the CFO, you better be expert, right? So part of what you need to think about is what level do I need to get? And then you need to design your learning journey to keep taking you to the next level. So that's one thing. What level of mastery do you need to achieve? Malcolm Gladwell and Anders were looking at peak performers. They were looking at Olympic athletes. They were looking at people who were the top of their field, which is where the 10,000 hours comes from. But all of us can benefit from the research, which says we kind of have this mistaken assumption in our mind that when you start learning something new, you're going to go from kind of new to excellent. There's just a straight line that you're going to get good at it. And that's not how it works. Typically, when we learn something new, we kind of focus on it and we get a little better, but then we stall out and we start to kind of flatten out that trajectory. That's the mindless practice. We keep doing it, but we're not pushing ourselves to our edge, right? That flow edge of being out of our comfort zone. So deliberate practice is, okay, I'm going to set a goal to achieve this level, and I'm going to use a coach to give me feedback, or I'm going to engage in some practice sessions to really get myself better. I am one of the people that's now totally crazy about pickleball. I just went to a 3-day clinic and I was intentionally getting help to take myself to the next level, right? I wanted to learn. So I engaged in something to help me get better. And then once we achieve that goal, you want to celebrate. And now it's time to set the next goal at the edge of your comfort zone. Now, what's the next thing you're going to do to keep improving? Or if you've decided novice level is fine, then you can kind of stall out there and be okay. But if you're really trying to keep getting better at something, you continually need to set new goals at the edge of your comfort zone and then use tools like learning events, mentors, coaches, feedback, practice, repetition to keep moving the needle.
You're right. That really depends on the level of competency you want to achieve, because I've read this in other books. Certain skills, you're just good enough is good enough, like your typing skills. Everyone could improve the speed at which they type, but they get to that point where it's good enough, or your driving skills. So that's definitely an important distinction to make, so that you make sure that you're only focusing on certain areas that you really want to achieve that mastery status, because it takes so much time on your part and you can't be an expert in everything. I hear this a lot from leaders. They go to learning events, they go to trainings, and it's great information to have, but it doesn't have the impact they were hoping. It doesn't connect to their situation, and they end up not applying it. So, and I'm sure you've heard the same things from attendees, not of your courses, but of other courses that say, there's really weaknesses in the learning industry these days. What are your thoughts about the current state of things and areas in which hopefully we could improve?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things that I love about the Learning Tribe, and I call them my tribe, is that it is a group of people who care deeply about others. They want others to succeed. They want to help people get better. They really believe in the potential of humans. It's a great crowd to hang out with. I think it's a really fun group of people who really are caring and compassionate. Where I think the learning industry struggles is that oftentimes how people get into a learning career, they had a role at the company. It turns out they were good at public speaking, and now all of a sudden they're tapped to come over into the learning space. Or now, because we have so many types of learning, someone can come into learning a learning team from a graphic design background or a web development background. So we have a lot of people coming into the space and they have an expertise in an area, but they don't necessarily have expertise in how humans learn or how to design learning. And I think that's where we can struggle a little bit, is now someone's in a role and they don't fully have the skill set they need to truly excel. I also think that we're all scarred by poor training. Like, we've all been through some poor training in our lifetimes. And if you haven't seen what excellent looks like, you may not know what bar you're shooting for. So I think it's important to go to industry events and attend conferences. I still struggle myself. I mean, I go to some of the big premier conferences for the field, and I still walk out of quite a few sessions because there's people who they've put together a presentation. That's not the same as designing a learning experience for your audience. And when I'm sitting in one of those, I'm like, ugh, there's not going to be much here for me to get because this is painful to sit through. I would love to see more of our tribe up level. And I think that requires an investment in them getting the skills they need when they start the role. And then for them to develop their mastery, to not stall out at the novice level, but keep pushing themselves to grow and improve. The cool thing is there's so many tools at our fingertips and there's so many opportunities to learn that if you want to set that for yourself, I think there's a lot of fun paths you can take. And it's a great tribe that will be supportive and encouraging, but you have to intentionally lean into it and you have to keep pushing yourself to grow.
You're right. And I love your model and your approach to instruction. That's that communication, demonstration, and experimentation, which really focuses on the application and getting people more comfortable with these skills. Because what we always say to members of our organization is that if we're in skill building, it's kind of like riding a bike. You can't learn it from reading a book. You have to practice the skill, and you have to practice enough to where you're comfortable, confident, and committed to using it. So perhaps you can just give us an overview of those three steps in your model.
Yeah. So to me, instruction lives as the combination of those three things. So communication is, typical teaching. You're training. You've put together a PowerPoint deck. You're giving people some theories, some models, some content. I think what can be a little dangerous is that folks come into the field oftentimes from being public speakers. And if you just focus on your experience on the stage and being the giver of knowledge, that's one piece of it. But if that's all you do, you're not really empowering your audience. So ultimately, you have to hand the baton to your audience and they need to try it. They need to get good at it. And your measure of your success is not, did you get a lot of applause, but did your audience actually do it? Did they get better at it? Did they get confident? So part of it is changing your mindset. Demonstration is like a second core tool you have. We don't use this enough. The reason why you want to use it is because humans have mirror neurons. And when we watch someone do a behavior, the same part of our brain fires. And so there is a lot to be said for demonstration. We were built as a species to watch by learning others. So you really want to demonstrate or bring some of your top performers in and film them and then use those videos. But oftentimes we don't demonstrate enough or we skip that altogether. And then the third is experimentation, which is now I'm done telling you and showing you. Now you got to do it. And that's where we create the space for someone to make mistakes, to mess up a little bit, and then start practicing with coaching and repetition. And that's where we start to groove the habit. And oftentimes, if you look at a lot of agendas for learning events, all the time is taken up. 90% of the time is communication. Maybe there's 10% demonstration and there's 0% experimentation, when really it should be more experimentation than communication. So you really want to get the time into the hands of the learners, and that's where the magic happens.
When I heard someone say we're living in a cult of content, and you're right, there's just so much content being put forward. There's not enough time for demonstration or experimentation. Especially, I think that demonstration piece is really underutilized before you get into the experimentation. So people can try to model that behavior when they try to experiment with it. But that experimentation phase, and I think you bring up a great point in your research, is that you have to have an environment of psychological safety. You have to talk about how it's okay to fail, to make mistakes as they're experimenting, because if they don't feel safe in that environment, then this is really not going to take effect.
Yeah, and I talk about this in the book. The brain structure, this kind of blew me away when I was doing the research. There is a brain structure, it's called the habenula, that tracks how we're doing. And its whole job is to keep us from failing again in the future. So if you think back to our hunter gatherer days, if I went down a trail and I found food or water, my brain would give serotonin, dopamine, serotonin, dopamine. And if I went down another path the next day and there was no food or water, the habenula kicks in. And what the habenula does is it restricts, it cuts off serotonin and dopamine. If you know anyone with depression, they have an overactive habenula. And so I go down that path and I don't get any of the psychological goodies. So in the future, when I come to that fork in the road, I just kind of feel like I want to take path A. Maybe not even consciously, but I'm just kind of drawn to path A and I'm kind of want to avoid path B. The habenula can be so active that it suppresses the motor neurons in your body, making it physically hard to walk down the wrong path. And again, this is why people who have chronic depression, when they say, I'm struggling to get out of bed, they're not kidding. They literally are having a hard time getting their muscles to move because the habenula has suppressed their motor neurons. So we want to think about creating an environment where mistakes that are natural in learning. We are designed to learn by failing. If you think about any baby who's learning to walk, they fall down a lot. And think about what would happen if we were blamed and shamed the entire time that's happening. But no, most of us are raised with, oh, good job, try again, woo, like it's made positive. And so we need to create the same kind of environments where making mistakes is celebrated as part of the learning process. And if you have blame and shame, the habenula is going to kick off and say, okay, learning is not safe. I'm not going to do that again. And so we really can hobble an organization with lack of psychological safety. It shuts down innovation, it shuts down risk taking, it shuts down growing and learning. So you need to find ways to make learning opportunities safe for mistakes. And then, of course, we want to set a high bar for performance and say, hey, it's okay to make mistakes, just don't make the same mistake twice. We want to learn from what we've done and how to get better, right? We don't want to have people stuck in a cycle of just making the same mistake over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. And during that learning event, we mentioned this before, but just to summarize, I think some of your top points is if you're a learning designer, if you're a teacher, if you're an instructor, 20 minutes of learning max, time for reflection, enough time to experiment, and demonstrating those skills are so essential in making this learning really stick for the learners. But what are some of the ways that we can extend the learning after the event? Because I think a lot of people they focus all of their efforts on the learning event itself, not enough time on the before and especially the after to really make that learning stick.
Yeah, I mean, this comes down to one of the stickiest ways someone's learn is insight. Is if you have an aha moment, your brain is actually permanently changed. And so if I can tell somebody something in 5 minutes or set up a 15-minute activity and they discover it themselves, even though it takes longer, I'm going to pick the activity because that aha moment they have, that flash of insight is permanent. It's really sticky. So oftentimes, we want to set up our learners to have these moments of learning on their own. So I really think about when I'm building a learning experience, I think about, okay, where are they before I meet with them? What do I need to have them experience when we're together? And I try to design some aha moments and some practice in that. But I also end with setting up their journey for 3 retrievals with sleep. I want them to go try it on and have some more aha moments. I'm actually thinking about the time they are away from me as time for more stuff to happen. And so I really leave sessions with not everything tied up with a bow, but for some curiosity and for some extended learning to happen. Whether that's go find some stuff on your own, or I've put together a list of things, but learning goes beyond the classroom, and some of the most powerful learning happens after they leave your formal session.
When you even mentioned that having an action plan, a 30, 60-day, 90-day action plan, putting time on their calendar, I found that to be very effective as well for them to review, to reflect, and maybe elaborate on some of those key takeaways. Really helps with just ingraining that learning at a deeper level within them. And then there's that piece on evaluating the learning. What do you think are some good questions or good ways to evaluate the learning after the program?
Yeah, no, I really think of the Jack Phillips model, the 5 levels of learning, right? So the most basic level is satisfaction. Did they like it, right? Well, it's great if they liked it, but that's only the very first level. The next level is, did they learn it? So you have to assess on some level, did they get the concepts? Do they understand it accurately? The third level is, are they using it, right? So are they changing their behavior on the job? So you need to intentionally measure that in some way and try to articulate what is the change in behavior and measure if it's happening. Then we want them using it out on the job, right? It's going to change the thing that you were going after. So let's say you were trying to increase retention of your best people. You need to measure, did manager training increase the retention of our best people? Did this marketing training make us faster to market? So there's some business needle you're trying to move. You got to measure that. That's the fourth level. And then the fifth level is ROI. Did what the training cost, was it less than the benefit you got from keeping your people being faster to market, whatever you're measuring? And so return on investment is the investment in learning cost less than the benefit you got from the change in behavior. So for me, I always think about the 5 levels. I don't want to design a training that people loved but didn't deliver on the rest of it. So you really have to be thinking the big picture.
And that's easier said than done because getting into the higher levels, that's a difficult ask. But you're right. Being intentional from the start, designing it that way, you have a much easier chance of that being done and being successful in those efforts. So, want to just touch upon this as we end today's episode. It's if leaders that are listening, if they want to create a culture of learning, where would you recommend they start in developing that culture of learning within their organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say it's a couple things. First of all, embrace your own learning. Leaders who role model learning and are talking about a skill they're learning or mistakes that they've made and how they're getting better really create a conversation around learning. So be learning, talk about your learning, show up at events. You're not too good to learn. So embrace your own learning. It's really powerful when senior leaders show up at a training that all the other employees have to go to. Second of all, empower your learning function. It's You want to hire the best people, you want to invest in them getting the skills they need to design great learning. Give them the resources and the support they need to really shine, because it's going to pay off in spades across your whole organization. And then you want to just make sure that you are building a culture of psychological safety. And that is making sure that there's not a culture of blame and shame. It's kind of how your managers treat people. When a mistake has happened, how do you talk about it in your organization? Lessons learned and things we're going to do differently, as opposed to whose fault is it, right? So, how you kind of conduct your day to day conversations really sets the tone for the culture of learning. And then finally, learning is owned by everyone in the organization. It's not just your learning team, although they play a pivotal role. So, really, expecting your managers and leaders at all levels to embrace learning, give people credit for their learning. There should be an expectation that people embrace learning and spend a certain number of hours every year improving their skills in something, and reward people for that. So those are all the ways you can, there's more, but those are a few of the ways you can enliven a learning culture.
Well, thank you for providing that information. Thank you for all the great information that you shared during this episode. Remind our listeners of how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Fantastic. Well, I'm on LinkedIn and I love connecting with people there. My website is my name, brittandreatta.com, and you'll find my 4 books anywhere you buy books. And then I'm the CEO of Brain Aware Training. So if you like how I talk about learning and you'd like to bring in some brain-based training programs into your organization, give us a call. We've got some really great programs that absolutely drive behavior change, increased performance, and great ROI.
If you like this episode, then please share it on social media and consider leaving a review or rating. If there are specific leadership topics or industry leaders you'd like us to feature on the podcast, we are welcome to your suggestions. Remember, knowledge's transformative power is only activated when it is acted upon. So what actions are you going to take on the insights and knowledge shared in this episode?